So I've had one or two situations with grey boxes appearing on my screen, so I hope that doesn't keep happening, but bear with me if it does. But what I'm talking about today is how is the climate crisis impacting Scotland's seabird populations. So my name is Francis Daunt and I work for the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. I'm a seabird ecologist there and I undertake research on North Sea seabirds. Seabirds are distributed globally across, and that's shown in this map here. And you can see that there are particular concentrations of seabirds in the southern oceans, where we have large populations of penguins and albatrosses, in the tropics, where there are particularly large colonies of terns and boobies, for example, but also in the temperate regions, including the central and North Atlantic around where we are, and in Europe itself. And we have large numbers of seabirds in the UK, and they're mainly the vast majority of these are found in Scotland and in Wales, as you can see from this map, which is taken from the most recent census, which was undertaken 20 years ago. In fact, there's a current census being undertaken now, but it's not quite ready, quite completed. So this is our latest information on the full census of the UK is from that period. And what this tells us is that UK holds internationally important numbers, and I'm sure the Scottish Seabird Centre had lots of similar sorts of statistics that some of you may have seen. But we can see that the UK holds a very high percentage of the global population of several of our species, including Manx shearwater, northern gannet, great skewer, lesser blackback gull, and European shag, but also important concentrations of other of our important species as well. And we have approximately 8 million birds from 25 different species, with guillemots the most common. Now, this compares with other important areas around the globe. We don't quite compare with the numbers seen in Alaska or New Zealand or the Barents Sea, but we're very much sort of in 4th or 5th place in terms of significant concentrations. Now, one of the reasons why this is such a key question at the moment is that we have seen some significant declines in our seabirds in the last 3 decades or so. So numbers appeared to reach a peak approximately in the 1980s. And since then, we've seen some marked declines. These are the latest figures from the JNCC's report on the changes in the last 20 years. And you can see significant changes in some of our species, such as those shown here. And in fact, 6 out of 25 breeding species of seabird in the UK have been classed as red listed. Now, the declines aren't universal. Some of our species are doing quite well, such as northern gannet and razorbill, as shown in these percentage figures in this table. But overall, there have been marked declines. And of course, people are concerned about that and want to understand why. Now, seabirds face a number of pressures. I've listed a whole range of them here: climate change, predators, invasive mammalian predators in particular, pollution and marine plastics. We have fisheries for the fish that the seabirds prey on, such as lesser sand eels, shown here. We have bycatch from fisheries, parasites, and renewables. Now, offshore renewables is obviously a very hot topic at the moment, but it won't be the subject of my talk today. I spoke to some of you a couple of years ago about this. Parasites, I know that you had a talk from Sarah Berth 2 or 3 weeks ago about parasites. Today, I'm going to talk about climate change and its effects on our North Sea seabirds. I'll touch briefly on fisheries as well, but the focus will be on climate change. So the aims of the talk are threefold. I want to just touch briefly on how we study seabirds, just to give you a flavor of how we tackle some of these questions. Then I want to go on to the sort of centerpiece of the talk, which is about Scottish seabirds and the climate crisis. And I'll touch on 2 main causes of climate change effects. One of these is effects of ocean warming. And this is called an indirect effect because it causes changes in the marine environment and changes working its way up the food web, causing changes in the quality of fish for the birds. And then effects of extreme events, which are much more direct. They act directly on the birds themselves rather than funneling up the food web. And then lastly, I'll touch on the widely reported guillemot and razorbill mortality we've seen on the East Coast over the last couple of months, and how that might have some relationship with this whole topic of the climate crisis. Now, we've been studying at UKCH have been studying seabirds on the Isle of May, just across the Firth of Forth, since 1972. And the study was set up by Mike Harris, and then soon after he was joined by Sarah Wanless. And the two of them undertook decades of work and are still working actively on the study now. So we have a great debt of gratitude to those two for setting up such what is the most comprehensive research study of seabirds in the UK. So we study 6 species: shags, puffins, kittiwakes, guillemots, razorbills, and fulmars. Now, what we're trying to get at in a research study of this kind is to understand what causes changes in population size. Now, this is called a study of demography. And what we do is we try and estimate the birth rates, the death rates, the immigration rates, and the emigration rates. And those 4 come together to give you your population size. So any change in any of those 4 can cause a change in population size. Now, birth rates is also called breeding success in seabirds. And what that is the number of chicks they raise for the number of nests that attempt to breed. And we study that on the Isle of May using monitoring plots, such as an example shown here in kittiwakes. And then we record the number of chicks fledged per active nest. And there's a nice family of shags with their chicks on the right there. Death rates is a more complicated thing to measure, and that's another way of another term for that is survival rates. What we're trying to do is understand what proportion of adult birds and juvenile birds survive each year. And we do that by individually marking birds using colorings, such as shown in these photos of kittiwakes and guillemots. And we then know how many of those are present in one year. And we can then we then look for those same individuals and can record what proportion of them returned the following year. And that's an estimate of survival rate or death rates. Now, those demographic rates help us understand causes, help us understand why populations are going up and down, but they don't give us the mechanisms. So if we're seeing changes in breeding success or survival, we don't know why. And of course, that's a key question if we're to understand climate change impacts. And one of the most important things we look at is their diet. And we measure that in a number of ways, depending on the species. Some species we observe and take photographs. Others we can capture and either get very clean, fresh samples, like on the silver foil in this picture, or for some species, they regurgitate and we get a rather messy diet sample, and we then digest that in the laboratory and extract these what are called otoliths, shown here in the top right. And that gives us a very good idea of what diet they're obtaining. Now, those are the building blocks to allow us to test some of the key questions we want to in this context. So moving on to the second part of my talk, I want to talk about Scottish seabirds and the climate crisis. And as I said before, I'll split these into 2 parts. The first part is about the effects of ocean warming. So what this map shows is the rate of ocean warming in degrees centigrade per decade. And this has increased in much of the globe, shown here in these redder tones in the map compared to bluer tones, which would have been a cooling. So we've seen marked warming of the ocean environment throughout much of the globe. And the warming has actually been more extensive in the Northern Hemisphere. And you can see around the waters of Europe, the warming, including the North Sea, the warming has been extensive, as it has in other parts of the North Atlantic. And we were part of a large global study of what the effect of temperature has been on and what the trends are over time in breeding success of seabirds across the globe. And what we found was there have been overall declines in breeding success over the last 30 years or so. And these are particularly pronounced in birds that are omnivorous or piscivorous, shown in the middle and right-hand graphs here, and particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. So our seabirds on the Isle of May are primarily piscivorous, and at times they're omnivorous, and sometimes at some periods of the season, but in the summertime when they're feeding their young, they're piscivorous. So you can see globally, Northern Hemisphere piscivorous and omnivorous species haven't been doing well. So this is an important clue that climate change is having a significant global impact. And we've been doing some more detailed studies of that in the North Sea. So this shows the North Sea food web, and what we're trying to understand is how climate warming is causing changes in the productivity of the oceans and how that works its way up the food web into the birds themselves. Now, the North Sea food web is called a WASP waste food web, and that's because the middle of the food web, which is called the mid-trophic layer, are these forage fish that the birds feed on, such as sand eels. And it's called wasp waste because there's actually very few species in that middle trophic layer, whereas there are many more species among predators and many more species at the lower trophic levels, such as plankton. So there are a small number of key species in this trophic level where the sand eels sit, and the sand eels themselves are the most important species of all. So they're an abundant fish in the North Sea on which many of our seabirds depend. And so what we're interested in understanding is what the impact of that warming has happened. So what we've done is we first of all compared the relationship between these demographic rates that I spoke to you about, the birth rates and death rates, and temperature. And what we've found is that there is a negative relationship between breeding success and temperature, and also between adult survival and temperature. And that's shown in these two graphs. You can see breeding success and survival on the y-axis and sea surface temperature on the x-axis. And so when conditions are warm, so breeding success and survival is lower, and when temperatures are cool, breeding success and survival is higher. Now, there is an additional part of the story. I did say I would touch on the effects of fisheries. I'm only going to do it at this point. And the effects of fisheries, it works such that for a period of about 10 years in the 1990s, just off the coast of Edinburgh, off the coast of the Isle of May, in an area called the Wee Bankie, there was a significant fishery for lesser sand eels. And what we found was that on top of an effect of temperature, we also found that breeding success was depressed, was lower when a fishery was operating. So there were two things happening at once. But if we return to the effect of climate, we can see this negative relationship. And what you can do when you have a relationship like that is you can then forecast likely change into the future. And that's because we now have predictions of future warming, as you'll be well aware of if you've been following the COP26 conference itself and all the recent information on climate change. We have these what are called climate scenarios, and that allows us to predict what breeding success might look like in the future. And what these studies show is that, yes, sea surface temperature is predicted to increase in the next 100 years, and it's predicted to have a negative impact on breeding success. So it's expected that breeding success will be lower towards the end of this century than it was at the end of the last century. And of course, that's very serious for seabirds because they rely on good breeding success to produce the next generation of young. And these effects are seen most strongly in puffins and kittiwakes, which is why the picture is shown there. So that's patterns between temperature and these key birth and death rates. But what's actually occurring in the food web that causes that link between temperature and the top predators? Well, it is quite complex, and I will only touch on it in a certain amount of detail because it is quite complicated, but it looks like a lot of this is about the timing of availability of food in the spring, because it's at that time when the different trophic levels are generally feeding and they need food to be available at the right time. And there seems to be a critical link between these sand eels that the seabirds depend upon and their prey, which are called copepod zooplankton. They're zooplankton called copepods. And it looks like, from recent research by colleagues, that there is a difference in the way that temperature affects the timing of these two trophic levels, and that they are becoming mismatched. And what this second graph shows is that the size of the year class of sand eels, the number of sand eels in the North Sea is dependent on this matching. So when they're well matched with their prey, they are abundant. But we've seen many years where they haven't been well matched, and this has caused a reduction in abundance. So it seems to be a critical link that could be behind a lot of the problems that we're seeing with sand eels and the seabirds. In terms of the seabirds themselves, and probably linked to that process I've just described, it looks very much like what we found is that there's been a decline in the quality of prey. So what this graph shows is that the number of fish has, the length of fish has declined over the last 30 years. This graph shows the size of fish that we get from puffins. So this is puffin food. And what we can see is this decline. And what I've shown here are two series of points, some circles and some diamonds. And that's because we tend to look at sand eels from the point of view of the young of the year, the fish that have hatched that year, and they're called O group, and then the adult fish, which are called 1+ group. Now, the seabirds feed on these two age classes of fish at different times of the summer. So they need both of them, and you can see that both age classes have shown declines. So what does that mean for seabirds? They've seen a decline in the quality of their prey. Well, one of the key consequences that we've seen is that the seabirds on the Isle of May have increasingly started to move away from sand eels as their principal prey. Now, what this graph shows for two of our species, guillemots and shags, is the diet proportions over the last 30 years or so. The black bars are O group sand eels that I was just telling you about, the young of the year, and the red bars are 1+ sand eels, the adult sand eels. The blue bars are clupeids, which are another family of forage fish that the seabirds like, and those include sprat principally and herring. And then there are some other species as well. And what you can see is that although sand eels of the two age classes are important and have remained important, they're actually becoming less important in particularly the last 10 to 15 years or so. As you can see, it's particularly clear in the shag in the right-hand graph. So it looks like the seabirds are moving away from sand eels, probably because their quality and abundance is reduced because of these changes as a result of climate change. And the key next question for us is to understand whether these alternative prey are giving them enough nutrition in order for them to rear their young and to survive. And well, I'll return a little bit to alternative prey in the last part of my talk to address that key question as to whether they are suitable alternatives. But just to summarize on this climate warming effect, we've done an analysis led by Sarah Berth, who you heard speak a couple of weeks ago, on the whole suite of marine birds that use the North Sea. So not just the 6 species that we study on the Isle of May, but summer and wintering birds, including marine ducks and all kinds of, and grebes and so on. And what Sarah did is she produced an index of population concern. And what she did is she combined whether there are negative or positive trends, but also whether these species were vulnerable to changes in temperature. And she found that 44% of marine birds in the North Sea were either in a high or very high population concern to climate. So clearly quite serious percentages of birds that are likely to be susceptible to further climate warming. Moving on to the second part of this central part of my talk about Scottish seabirds and the climate crisis. The second main climate effect is effects of extreme events. Now, we're all very familiar with extreme events, whether they're storms or droughts. They're, in a sense, much more obvious than warming effects. Now, as I said before, these extreme events act directly on the birds. So rather than causing changes through the food web, they're more likely to cause impacts on the birds, either causing them to have difficulty to feed or causing them to have problems to remain warm, and they can get problems of exposure due to rain or storm events. And that's why they're called direct effects, not indirect effects. Now, these storms are obviously very obvious. They're very familiar to people who live in the marine environment. You can get scenes like shown in this picture. This is the west cliffs of the Isle of May on a strong westerly gale. And these are actually breeding ledges shown here, and the surf and wash and spray launching it up the cliff face. And of course, the key thing for these breeding birds is the extent to which the wave action can actually reach their breeding ledges. So if it's just spray, the birds are generally quite good at dealing with it. But of course, it's a very different story if waves are actually crashing over their nests, and they soon succumb to that. Now, the adult birds don't succumb to that, but their nests get washed away. So summer storms and summer rain and wind events are not uncommon, but serious events that cause significant mortality are quite unusual. So we had a serious rain event in 2004. It's been one of the worst ones we've had. And that was a period of approximately 48 hours of continuous rain. And it's that sort of length of time, which is of course quite rare in summer, which causes significant problems. And two species that really suffer from this are shags. And that's because the chicks, when they're medium-sized but still covered in down, they can no longer be brooded by their parents, and so they really are out in the open, and because they don't have feathering, they're not waterproofed, and they die from hypothermia, as shown in this chick on the left. And in that particular event, 61% of shag chicks died in a 48-hour period. So very dramatic. And then you can get flooding of puffin burrows, as shown in this picture on the right. So puffin burrows are generally very well designed to withstand rain events, and they build them in a particular way to ensure there's runoff and that no water gathers in the area where the chick is hiding. But when the rain is very, very severe, even that can cause problems for them. But then another example is a wind event, and we tend to see those reasonably regularly. And one of the worst examples that we've had in recent years was the 2011 storm. This occurred on the 29th of May and is shown, what these graphs shows is 24-hour periods with maximum gust speeds. And the 2011 storm is the one with the dark circles, and that's you can see had the highest gust speeds that we've seen of any of the worst. These are showing the worst summer storms that we've had in the last 30 years, the 8 worst storms, and it was the worst. And what we were able to do, because it had been forecast, we knew in advance that it was on its way. We did a full survey of all the nests, and this is work led by Mark Newell, who spends his summers on the Isle of May studying seabirds. And he was able to monitor all the study plots the day before it was due to arrive. Then there was the day of the storm, and he and others had to hide inside the house waiting for it to pass. And then he went to study the next day, so 2 days after his first monitoring, to see what proportion had survived. And he found that there was significant loss of nests as a result of that storm, and in particular for razorbills, with 36% of nests lost to one single storm event. Now, these are long-lived birds, and therefore a single event is unlikely to cause a significant problem for the population as a whole. It may be that a good proportion of nests were lost in a particular year. Birds may relay as if the storm has occurred early enough in the season, and therefore they may have a second go. But all in all, because these species have many, many breeding attempts, one lost attempt or a few lost attempts may not be too significant. Of course, the key question is how many of these events are there going to be? What's generally more serious is winter storms, because winter storms can cause significant mortality of adults. So I've just explained that they're long-lived species. So if you lose a cohort of chicks to a storm, that's of course very sad, but it's unlikely to cause a major change to the population size. But if you lose a significant proportion of adults, that's going to cause significant problems. And we've seen mortality associated with winter storms a number of times in recent years, particularly affecting European shags, which are very susceptible to these, but also puffins and other species as shown in these photographs. And what this graph shows on the left here, work led by Morten Fredrickson, a colleague at former colleague at CEH, is that it's that combination of precipitation and onshore winds that causes European shags real problems. And it seems to be that when there are easterly storms on the east coast, then European shags have a real problem feeding, and that's the wave action hitting the shore. And because they're benthic feeders feeding right close to the coast, they just simply can't catch food. And because the east coast of Scotland has very few islands and has a comparatively simple coastline, certainly much less complex than the west coast, there's really nowhere to hide. So they often have terrible problems when there is a sustained period of easterly winds in winter. And you can see they can take evasive action, like in this photograph of Fraserburgh Harbour in the top left, where they go into the shelter of the harbour and perhaps ride it out by sitting on the seashore. Now that's okay if the storm only lasts a couple of days, but they soon start to starve if it lasts longer than that. Now, one of the interesting studies we've been able to do recently is to see whether different parts of the population are affected by these storms in different ways. So on the Isle of May, we colouring many of the adults and as many of the chicks as we can, using these colorings with these unique combinations that you can see here. And this is a family of an adult female and her 3 chicks, and you can see they've all been coloringed. And what we're trying to do then is to observe these birds after they've left the nest, so the juveniles, but also the adults. And we can do this because shags have this handy behavior of spending a portion of the day on land. So most seabirds are pelagic in winter, and which means they're out at sea, so you don't tend to see them on land. Shags, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, rather like cormorants as well, you will see them on any day of the year. And because they have these visible colorings, we can use telescopes and high quality cameras to get observations. And we now have over 70,000 observations of over 20,000 individuals that have been coloringed over the last 10 years. And it allows us to follow them throughout the year. And it means we can then categorize them as those individuals that stay resident, which means they stay near their or at their breeding colony throughout the year, or those that migrate, so they move to a different location. And this population of shags on the Isle of May are what's called partially migratory, which means some individuals stay put and others migrate. And what you can see in this map is that there tend to be there's really 4 main areas that the Isle of May shags spend the winter. One is around the Isle of May, as shown here in red, but there are 3 areas to the north of here around Aberdeenshire and into the Moray Firth, where significant numbers of birds also go. And what we've found is that the likelihood of them surviving an extreme weather event differs on whether they're residents or migrants. What this graph shows here, and sorry, it's a bit complicated, but each narrow grey shaded area is a year running from 2009 to 10 through to 2017 to 18. And it shows the survival probability of the shags. And you can see in 3 of the winters, there was lower survival rates, particularly the case in 2012-13, and then somewhat true as well in 2013-14, and in the last year, 2017-18. So in those 3 years, survival was significantly lower, and the mortality was associated with these winter storms. You can see, though, in the other 6 years, survival was really very high indeed. So when there isn't stormy weather, shags tend to do very well in winter. But the other important finding was that the survival probability depended on whether you were a resident or a migrant. And in the 2 worst winters, we found that the survival probability of residents was lower than migrants. Now, this is an intriguing result that could have some very important consequences. If the number of storms increases, and this is a consistent difference between residents and migrants, we could find a situation where the population starts to change its behavior, whereby because the number of migrants surviving is much higher than the number of residents, and if that behavior is passed on from one generation to the next, in other words, if it has a genetic component, it could be that this population starts to become more migratory. And that, of course, has lots of ramifications, not about their ecology and about their conservation. And this extensive colouring study has allowed us to look at extreme events in a lot more detail than we otherwise could in the past. Now, these European shags are, as I said, very susceptible to these winter storms. And so we're keen to understand what possible impact the future might hold. And so many climate models are now predicting an increase both in the frequency and the severity of extreme events in the future. So that could be very bad news for European shags and possibly other seabirds as well. And so what this graph tried to do was to model what the future might look like under a scenario of greater extreme events. So there's an index of that shown on the x-axis from low rate of extreme events to high rates of extreme events on the right-hand side. And shown in the white is the probability of extinction with the white squares, and the black circles are the growth rate of the population. And you can see as the number of extreme events goes up, the population growth rate declines quite markedly, and the probability of extinction of the population starts to increase very rapidly. So if the number of extreme events does increase, in particular winter storms, it could spell very bad news in future for the European shags on the east coast of Scotland. So I'll just move on to the last part of my talk. So I've spoken so far about the effects of climate warming operating through changes in the food web and how that has a knock-on effect on seabirds. And I've talked about the effects of extreme events, in particular stormy and winter storms, and how that has a direct effect on mortality rates of seabirds. So they're really being hit by those two processes. We've just experienced, as many of you will be aware of, a significant mortality of almost exclusively, not entirely, but almost exclusively guillemots and razorbills on the East Coast during autumn 2021. And I want to describe that to you and set it in the context of climate change and the climate crisis and what the possible cause might be. So just to describe the event to you, it first came to light in approximately late August, with dead auks beginning to be found on beaches on the Scottish east coast, and mortality in Scotland peaked in the first half of September through to the middle and late weeks of the month. This mortality then spread southwards into England during September, and during October, mortality was then observed in Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium. So this was a very widespread event spanning both sides of the North Sea. The other key point about it was that this was a very unusual season for high mortality to be observed. So I've spoken so far in the last section of my talk, I've talked about winter storms, and we know that these cause mortality to seabirds, and I showed you some examples in European shags. What was very odd here is that generally we don't see high mortality in this time of the year when conditions are normally quite benign. And in fact, there was no real evidence of poor weather in the North Sea at this time at all. So it doesn't seem to be an extreme weather event that's causing this mortality, but it's significant. More than 3,000 have been reported dead, and it's much the largest mortality for this time of year that has been observed in the North Sea in these two species. And we've collected a number of corpses from different locations and in all of these different countries. And without exception, the birds have been emaciated, so they appear to have died of starvation. And we tested some for avian flu, well, not us, but the specialist laboratory that does that, and they've all come back negative. So it seems to be that there's something that's causing these birds to starve. And of course, the key question is, what has caused them to starve? Now, one of the clues about that was about not just the level of mortality, but the unusual behaviors that we were seeing. So we were seeing birds, as is not unusual with starving birds, that you see these moribund individuals on beaches and so on, shown here on the left. But in fact, there were one or two strange observations of birds actually approaching people. And in one case of a bird swimming in the shallow water, actually trying to climb onto a swimmer. Now, these birds are generally not tame, and they generally want to keep a good distance from people. Now, starving birds that are very close to death and have lost all their strength, very often they can't move away from people because they've lost all their strength, but it's unusual for them to actually approach people. We then had stories, a number of observations of guillemots and razorbills traveling up rivers, shown in these middle pictures. And we had cases of these two species traveling over 20 miles upriver. And we had bird watchers birdwatching their patch that had never seen these species before, getting patch ticks for the first time. And of course, these are people that understand their patch very well indeed. So it was clearly highly unusual observations. And we also had, and this is one of the really curious things about the whole event, we had a number of observations of birds feeding, excuse me, I'll just take a drink, feeding on fish. And so we were confused because we thought, well, if there is food, why are they starving? And I'll just check, I hope this works. This is just a little video of a guillemot feeding on some fish very close to some people, and it illustrates both the unusual nature of the behavior, but also including the tameness.
That's so cool.
So I hope that video worked. What it showed was a guillemot that was feeding in just a few inches of water, and it was chasing some fish, and it was willing to do so very close to the people. I don't know if you heard the sound, but the people were sort of delighted and curious about getting such a close wildlife experience. And we, in fact, had a number of reports from the public of having these very special close-up experiences of these birds, but then they started to realize that this wasn't good news. So clearly there's the general question that when birds are tame and listless like this, they're in a very poor shape. Also this rather strange behavior of sitting on a swimmer and swimming in amongst people got people wondering about what the cause might be. And so there've really been two possible causes that have been put forward, and we're currently investigating these, and we don't have the answer yet, but I'll just go through what the possible causes of this very extensive mortality might be. Well, auks feed on forage fish, and at this time of the year, they will be, generally speaking, be offshore. So they'll be out of sight of land, and they will, the father takes, in guillemots and razorbill, it's the father that takes the half-grown chick to sea, as many of you will know, and the mother is generally more mobile. So what the father does is, because his chick is flightless, he then molts all his flight feathers, because he has to do it once a year, and it's the best time to do it because he can't fly anyway because he's got to look after his chick. And the two of them work together as a pair, and they swim around and they can't fly. Now they're generally offshore because they want to get away from predatory gulls, but something brought these populations to the Scottish coast and then to the other coasts around the North Sea. So that seems to be a key part of the story. What brought them here in the first place? And they would normally be 50, 80, even more miles offshore. Now, there were some mild easterly winds, but not really the strength of wind that would drive a population to the coast, as might happen during a storm. So there appears to the first possible cause is some problem in the prey availability. Now, some fish were found dead on the beaches, but these were quite isolated incidents, so they were quite useful because we were able to take some and send them to the laboratory for analysis. But there's really not been much direct evidence of problems with the fish. So we're having to work with the information that we have, And we will be doing the following investigations. So there was a survey of the North Sea undertaken of the key fish that the seabirds feed on during August. That's very well timed because it was at around that time that things started to go wrong. So we'll be looking at the data from that survey to see if it was any signs of the populations of fish being lower than they normally would at this time of year. I mentioned alternative prey. We don't think that at this time of year, guillemots and razorbills probably are feeding on sand eels because it's at a time when sand eels tend to be unavailable. They're buried in the sand and they're probably feeding on other prey. And it may be that those prey, such as sprats, and it may be those prey were not around this year or were very poor energy quality. So we're also looking at their energy density to see if the prey were poor quality. But we're also interested in the high summer temperatures that were apparent in the North Sea throughout the summer of 2021. There was a very important and potentially useful in terms of understanding this event, but also very sad event in Alaska called over the period from 2014 to 2016, and they called it the blob. And what this was a very large area of very high sea temperatures in the areas where auks forage. They have auks there as well. And they observed 62,000 auks dead in that period from 2014 to 2016. So much bigger events than the one we're having at the moment in Scotland. But they managed to piece together the evidence and came to the conclusion that it was due to very high sea temperatures, and that this caused a reduction in the nutrients to phytoplankton and zooplankton, and then an overall reduction in the biomass of the fish that the birds feed on. So it looks like this low current, high temperature, very stable mass of water caused catastrophic food conditions for birds. And we're interested to know whether a similar process is taking place in the North Sea at the moment. And the second possible cause, which was triggered by these curious behaviors that I told you about, is chronic effects of algal poisoning. Now, investigations are ongoing, but those behaviors are symptomatic of birds that have lost their sense of direction. And algal poisons can do that, as was shown in a very famous story about the effects of algal poisoning on California sea lions about 15 years ago. And that work showed that the brains of these animals had been damaged by the poisons, causing them to be disorientated. And so some of these overly tame behaviors and traveling up rivers may have been a result of this. And there was a large algal bloom off northeast Scotland discovered by my colleague Peter Miller at PML, which could have been a cause for this event. We're looking therefore at these two possible causes, and investigations are ongoing. But just to conclude on the talk as a whole, Scottish seabirds have shown marked declines in the last 3 decades. Ocean warming has changed the quality and availability of their key prey, lesser sand eels. And future predictions suggest further declines of seabirds are likely. So with that backdrop of changes with ocean warming, this could be compounded by the effects of extreme weather, which is predicted to become more frequent and severe. So they may be hit by that as well. And this recent mortality could be a further warning of the impact of climate change on Scottish seabirds. We need to do some more investigations to be sure of that, but it may well be that it's another symptom of the climate crisis in Scottish seabirds, and we will continue to investigate to understand that further. So it just leaves me to thank a whole series of colleagues that have helped with this research, in particular the team on the Isle of May, led by Mike Harris and Sarah Wanless, who set up the study. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Francis, for that incredible insight into your very important work, providing so many insights into the seabird population and what's going on because of the climate crisis. Really, really quite fantastic stuff. So now is time for a Q&A. So if anybody has any questions they'd like to put to Francis on any of the research, if you'd like to pop it into the chat box, we'll be able to pick that up and put them to Francis. I've got a question for you actually, Francis. So you mentioned in your talk about the fact that bird watchers spotted the guillemots going upstream when they're in their local patch, and that the public sent you videos. How important is it for those sightings to kind of come to you? And how, if a member of the public sees something like that themselves, how can they inform you, and how can that help research in the future?
So the public have been fantastic throughout this event. They have sent us huge numbers of records. We had, because of the media interest, we were able to circulate the general email to send information, which was inquiries@ceh.ac.uk, and we got a lot of records that way. We got a lot of other records on Twitter as well. And so it gave us a really good picture of the location and timing of the different of the mortality across Scotland and Northern England. So yes, it's just a case of encouraging the public to continue to send in any records they have, including any records of no mortality. That's also useful to know as well. But it's important to say that the public are encouraged not to touch either birds that are alive or birds that have died, because of the risk of catching disease, for example, from them. And if you do see any live moribund birds, so not live birds that are in the water looking okay, but a live bird that looks very unhappy on the beach, you must contact the SSPCA and not try to handle them yourself.
Yes, absolutely. We get a lot of calls at the Seabird Centre about that, and it's wonderful to have members of the public wanting to help, but absolutely calling up the SSPCA and getting them to come out and help is definitely key. Thank you for that. So we've got some few questions coming into the chat now, which is great. Let's have a look. Jamie has said, we've had a fair few puffins washing up on beaches up here in Orkney. Hello from Orkney. Could this be due to some factors, due to the same factors, such as lack of prey and or algal poisoning?
So thank you, Jamie. That's actually a very interesting report, because we've had very, very, very few puffins in this mortality, and the few that I have been aware of have been in Orkney. Now it sounds like that's more than I was aware of, so I'd very much like to hear. I've only really heard of, I could count on one hand the number of puffins that we've been told about, and they've been virtually all in Orkney. It sounds like there's more going on up there, and indeed it could well be that the cause is the same. It's just that there's something about it affecting guillemots and razorbills much more extensively. Now, puffin distribution at this time of year isn't terribly well understood, but it actually makes sense from what we know, that they would be distributed more around the Northern Isles than, for example, guillemots and razorbills. So that also fits. But I would love to know the details, please, if that could be sent in.
Great, thank you, Jane, for reporting that. A question from Mark. Mark asks, kittiwakes have declined across most parts of their North Sea range. Do we know why the decline has been so severe in the north, e.g. Shetland, but less so further south, e.g. Dunbar, Farnes and Bempton? Is this an indication that the seas have warmed more in the north than the south of the North Sea?
So, the situation in the Northern Isles is very serious indeed, and our experiences of what happens in the Northern Isles going back to the 1980s is that it tends to be somewhat different from, for example, the east coast of Scotland. And a lot of that seems to be to do with the fact that there is a particular subpopulation of sand eels that the birds are reliant on, that operate in those waters, that is somewhat different to the populations that are found in the North Sea. And some of the real problems in the 1980s in the Northern Isles were put down to this. And recent GPS tracking of Northern Isles seabirds suggests that they're having to make much longer foraging trips. So I suspect it's not just a simple question of temperature. It's probably a much more complicated question about different populations of sand eels, but certainly very worrying indeed in the Northern Isles at the moment.
Great, thank you. Pete says, I encourage members of my wildlife group to use iRecord to report sightings. Are these transferred to Francis?
Yes, we'll be able to get hold of those. Thank you.
Fabulous, excellent, great to hear people recording their sightings on iRecord as well. That's great. Mike is asking, how do you think fisheries need to change in the UK, Europe to protect seabirds, marine biodiversity, and how should MPAs be managed to protect our seabirds?
Okay, there's a lot there. I maybe won't capture all of that, but I mean, you probably aware, or many of you will be aware, that there's been that the sand eel fishery off the East Coast has been closed for for over 20 years now. So obviously fishery closure is one option that's already in place on the East Coast of Scotland. There is a small scale scientific fishery that's been undertaken there, but generally speaking, we haven't seen anything like the landings that were taken in the 1990s. So a key question is, what is the right approach where sand eel fisheries are still operating significantly, for example, in the Dogger Bank? Because we know that for some of our species, kittiwakes, for example, that we see declines associated with the fishery. But it's important to add that it's not universal. So several of our seabird species do not appear to show an effect of the fishery, but they are affected by climate change. Sorry, I've only covered a few of the parts of that. It was a very big question, maybe. Sorry, apologies.
It is a big topic, absolutely.
So MPAs, if I can just touch on MPAs. MPAs is a very interesting question, because the thing about MPAs is what are they actually for? Because you can designate an area as an MPA, but that doesn't change it at all, unless there's some sort of management changes associated with that. And really, a lot of what we're talking about is marine spatial planning, including fisheries and offshore renewables, because we're not able to manage it for climate change, at least not in terms of local management. So it's a question of what we're doing with those MPAs and what we're trying to stop doing in them and what we're trying to manage. That's the key question. And climate change, unfortunately, doesn't fit very easily within that.
Absolutely. We'll see if we can arrange a talk on MPAs at some point,
yes,
to expand on that topic too. Absolutely. Jason is asking, what are the potential solutions to climate change and algal bloom causes, and expresses concern even with COP26 happening and looking beyond COP26, is climate change going away and are our seabirds doomed?
Well, obviously, we're all watching very closely to see what's agreed at COP26, but really, we are unlikely to see a rapid or very, very substantial change, and we're likely to see further warming. Now, that's not to say that seabirds are doomed. Not all seabirds are declining. We may see some changes in range, and we may see some changes in the different composition of different species. So as an example, gannets are doing very well in the UK, and some of our other species are doing okay as well. But it looks like several of our species, we may see that they decline significantly and potentially shift northward. And we may actually lose one or two species, but it may not be in our lifetimes, but it might be by the end of this century. Yes,
lots of unanswered questions and modelling going on, isn't there, at the moment? A question from Susan. Do you feel that your solid and compelling science about the climate effects on seabirds is reaching and influencing policymakers? If not, what steps could be taken to enhance this?
So that's a fascinating question, because what policymakers, it depends who you mean by policymakers. If you mean people who manage the coastal environment of the North Sea and questions to do with fisheries and offshore renewables and MPA designations at that sort of scale, climate change is a very difficult issue for them to deal with, because they spend considerable time trying to get things in place based on what the status quo is. And we don't really have a dynamic sort of designation. So for example, if an MPA no longer warrants being an MPA because the key species has shifted north, we don't really have that sort of dynamic mechanism of de-designating things and so on. So whilst they're very aware of climate change, they don't really have the processes yet to factor it in. But I think that will change. It's very much in the conversation, and people are talking about it all the time. So I'm hopeful that over the next few years that will get very much in the thinking.
Great, love a bit of hope.
Yes.
Wonderful. A question from someone under the name of Bacondust. It says, hi Francis, are other agencies, DEFRA, etc., taking these bird mortalities seriously? If so, are you aware of what they are doing? What do you think of the possible links to the crustacean deaths reported on the northeast coast?
So I think Bacondust is probably Bacondust who helps me on Twitter. So hello, Bacondust. Bacondust has helped collate various reports. So it's also a good nickname. So DEFRA have mostly focused on any evidence of notifiable diseases. So they are really at the heart of investigations of avian influenza, and a number of birds have been tested and found to be negative. So there was an incidence of avian flu in the Northern Isles and the Western and the Outer Hebrides in the summer with great skewers, which was a strange and an odd event. And so obviously they were concerned as to whether this might be going on here, but there really is no evidence for it at present. So the Environment Agency has taken the crustacean deaths seriously, and samples have been taken, and actually they have been they're being analysed by the same toxins lab, the Algal toxins lab, that have been analysing the fish and bird samples. The advantage of invertebrates is they tend to accumulate toxins for much longer than fish and birds, for example, and so really it's a very interesting set of species to test it on, because if there were toxins in the environment, they're more likely to show it. So there's going to be fewer false negatives, if you know what I mean by that. So yes, that's in process. So those crustacea will have some similar tests, though my understanding is generally very large, sort of high levels of mortality of crustacea in a very small location tend not to be caused by that, but caused by oxygen depletion, which can be caused by algae as well, but rather than toxins. But that's not really my area of expertise, but hopefully we'll get to the bottom of that as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for all the questions coming through, by the way, everybody. This is brilliant. So Margaret has said that in the Bristol Channel, in Clevedon Marine Lake this morning, we had a young shag swimming and trying to feed around the swimmers. So that's reporting there. So if Margaret were to submit that to the inquiries, would that
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So shags haven't featured at all so far in this event, but we're willing. We've got an open mind about anything at the moment. It could be that it spreads across species. It may move to the west coast. So yeah, any new records is always welcome, and we'll then start to collate what might be occurring, such as this shag, which sounds very like that video I showed you of the guillemot.
Great, thank you. And was that email address enquiries at the UKCEA?
Yes, and it's inquiries with an E. I know inquiries is sometimes INQ, but it's ENQ, spelled ENQUIRIES, inquiries at ceh.ac.uk.
Great, thank you. Lovely, some more questions, wonderful. I have heard a couple of explanations for poor sand eel quality, one being that their food chain are now warmer species with lower calorific value. The other is that warmer water reduces energy reserves of sand eels due to increased metabolism. Are these likely factors in your opinion?
Those are two very significant processes that may well be important in the North Sea. So indeed, so there's two copepod prey that this questioner is alluding to, one of which is a cold water loving prey and one species, and the other is a warm water loving species. And the abundance of the warm water loving species has increased in association with the warming of the North Sea, and is thought to be less nutritious for sand eels. But Actually, it is an important process, but it's a fantastically complex question, unfortunately. So we're trying to get our heads around it. But intuitively, it's a very real idea. As for the metabolism, absolutely. So I mentioned the blob in Alaska towards the end of my talk, and that's thought to be a very big part of the story, which is that the metabolic rate of fish goes up when it's warm and they require more nutrition and actually then that causes knock-on problems because they need more food to maintain that high metabolism, and so on. And so yes, that could well be occurring in these particularly warm summers like 2021.
Great. Question from Jacqueline. Have you seen evidence of climate change impacts on other species, whether on other seabirds, plant life, or marine mammals?
So climate change impacts are probably apparent in, well, they're certainly apparent in several of our seabird species, particularly where we see it most strongly in kittiwakes. We've got evidence for it in guillemots and puffins as well. It's likely to be a significant factor in the marked decline of Arctic skuas in the Northern Isles. The stories are often, you do need to be a bit forensic about things. I think I would encourage people not to make too many sweeping statements about climate change and seabirds. So, for example, the Arctic skua story is one that also includes the effects of predation by great skuas. And so it's often a complicated picture, but across the piece, there are several species where it seems to be playing out. And then there's one or two that seem to be, if you like, bomb-proof to climate change. And the most striking example of that is northern gannet, which have shown marked increases throughout the period when other species have declined.
Great, thank you.
Oh, and sorry, they asked about other non-seabirds. Funnily enough, the evidence for impacts of climate change on marine mammals is much less clear-cut. A number of marine mammal scientists are very skeptical of the evidence of climate change on marine mammals, so it's much less clear.
Oh, that's really interesting. Is that because of lack of data, or just finding out is too complicated because there's so many?
So there are some challenges with data with marine mammals because they're particularly difficult to study, as you can imagine. So probably some of the best information on marine mammals comes from seals, because they have this, rather like birds, they have this handy behavior of coming onto land to haul out or to breed. And I think seals are possibly not so in the same way that gannets can do this. Seals have a very, what's called Catholic diets. They can feed on all kinds of different prey. So they seem to be less sensitive to some of these seabirds that are very, sort of don't really have a good plan B if their principal prey becomes unavailable. So we've mentioned the kittiwake, but the auks, the shags, yeah, they can feed on 2 or 3 different prey, probably rather successfully. But gannets are can feed on all kinds of things, from tiny O-group sand eels to 10-inch mackerels. So and grey seals are the same. And the decline of harbour seals, which has occurred in a number of parts of Scotland, is they don't really think that's as a result of climate change, but other factors, including competition with grey seals, disease, and other things.
Thank you very much. Pete is asking, during the Meet the Scientist talk on sea mammals in the 4th, we heard that nurdles concentrated poisons such as DDT and PCBs. Is it possible that these factors could affect other seabirds?
So we've just started a new project. It's a new grant funded by the Natural Environment Research Council on contaminants in the Firth of Forth, and our study species is the European shag, and we're looking at the effects of contaminants, including plastics. So contaminants include all the different pollution types that get into the water and into the food web. Now, plastics can sort of have a number of different effects. One is the physical effect of having nurdles or other plastic macroplastics, as they're called, large pieces of plastic in your stomach causing physical problems. And then microplastics can actually result in chemicals getting into your bloodstream and causing chronic effects on the physiology of the birds. Now, my understanding is that the latest evidence suggests that the most likely effect is the direct effect of the chemicals in the plastics on wildlife, and that this idea that other chemicals attach to nurdles and other plastic compounds is actually not thought to be as important an effect as first thought, that the process is not thought to be as important. However, you tend to get high levels of different sorts of contaminants in the same place. So the Firth of Forth has had a long industrial history. So there's a whole suite of heavy metals, organic chemicals, microplastics, pharmaceuticals, and other compounds that are all associated with human populations. So even if that particular process that was asked about of binding onto plastics isn't thought to be as important as we thought, nonetheless, they're probably both in the environment anyway, even if they're not bound together. And so that means that there may well be multiple contaminants hitting these birds at the same time.
Lovely.
Sorry, that was quite complicated. Apologies.
No, it's beautifully explained for such a complicated topic. And another thing that seabirds are having to cope with alongside all the other things that are happening as well. So definitely something that also needs to have attention.
Yeah, and I would just add that whilst there has been a lot of focus on microplastics ever since the David Attenborough Blue Planet series, and it is a very serious problem, and the concentrations of plastics are extremely concerning in the marine environment. Nonetheless, a lot of ecotoxicologists are more worried about other chemicals than they are microplastics. They're more worried about certain organic chemicals that are produced by people, such as flame retardants, for example, that unfortunately have a very robust and survive in the marine environment for a very long time, and therefore they get into the tissues of birds and cause problems.
Absolutely, and it just shows us the seabirds are struggling with these things as well. That just indicates the health of the marine environment as a whole, and that will obviously implicate us further down the line as consumers of marine products and fish as well.
I mean, the other thing to add to that is that whether it's plastics or whether it's organic chemicals or whether it's pharmaceuticals. So, for example, apparently we throw away 50% of our pharmaceuticals and they end up in landfill sites, but we also flush through a lot of pharmaceuticals into the sewage system because our body doesn't process all of them. Apparently, so all of these things, which of these heavy metals, all of these contaminants, they all have what you might call subtle effects. I don't mean all, but the vast majority of them have subtle effects. It's really hard to demonstrate a genuine impact. An obvious example that's not like that at all is oiling events. So if there's an oil spill, that can have catastrophic immediate impacts. But most of these other chemicals we're talking about that have been moving into the marine environment slowly, relentlessly over the decades, they're not killing birds stone dead in front of your eyes, but what they probably are doing is slowly reducing their condition in ways that we're trying to study.
Absolutely. And Nicole has actually just popped into the chat there. Are some of these dead birds also assessed for the contaminants, pollutants?
Yes, so we haven't completed that work yet, but we're looking at the algal toxins, and then we're looking at some of these other contaminants as well, and then we're looking at disease, and then we're looking at basic structural postmortems to look at, is it starvation or some other cause? So yes, that's people were very keen to understand the cause of this event, but it's a really tough question, and it involves a lot of piecing together of evidence. So we're just asking everyone to be patient, and we'll work through the data and hopefully have some answers for you all.
Great. Well, that is all the questions at the moment that have come through the chat. Thank you so much, everybody, for that. There's still a bit of time if anybody wants to add a final question in there. I suppose a question for me, Francis, to kind of wrap it up is, obviously all of that information is quite hard hitting. It's quite easy to feel disheartened and to feel like, yes, absolutely, as someone was asking, is the marine environment doomed? Have you got any good news stories or kind of a hopeful message for us to take away, or something that we can do to help the seabird populations?
So, I mean, although these events such as happening with guillemots and razorbills are very real and very sad, there are still lots of seabirds out there. And I would just encourage anyone, it's a bit harder in winter, but come next spring, do your best to either get to a colony live or get to the Seabird Centre and see them on the cameras. And hopefully they'll be back there. And there's still huge numbers of seabirds in Scotland. So there's lots still to enjoy, even if we are possibly seeing some changes that worry us. There'll still be plenty to look at for some years ahead.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Francis. And thank you so much, everybody, for attending. We've been putting in the chat, there's some links to Francis and his team's brilliant work. So grab hold of those links to find out more information. And also the email address about how to report sightings is also in the chat as well. So scroll back through there to find that. But yes, thank you for attending. As always with these sorts of events, we really appreciate any feedback that you might have in terms of what events to run in the future, what topics, and how we've done this evening as well. So a link will be provided in the chat to an online form, and we'd appreciate just a few moments of your time for that. And also, as a conservation charity helping the seabirds, any donations, memberships that can be given to us is greatly appreciated, so we can continue our work conserving and educating people about the effects of climate change on seabird populations as well. In terms of upcoming events, so on the 16th of November, we have the annual Brian Nelson Memorial Lecture. It's being held online in partnership with the RSPB. It's featuring a talk by Professor Stephen Vautier from Heriot-Watt University called Nelson's Gannets in the Digital Age. So this will be on what we have learned from the use of biologgers on seabirds over the past decades. So really interesting. We've got details of that on our website, and also a link will be provided in the chat as well. And also a bit of exciting news that there's an opportunity to buy a signed copy of a hard book of the Galapagos Crusoes, which is a book written by Brian Nelson's wife, June, about their adventures to the Galapagos Islands. So this is an opportunity at the moment to buy a signed copy. It's the details available on our LinkedIn page, but also hopefully in the chat. And any money given to the buying of these books goes to the Galapagos Conservation Trust as well. So lots of things to expand your knowledge and interest in seabirds and seabird research as well. But yes, I think that is all from me. Just going to scan the chat one last time, see if anyone's got any last minute things. Not that I can see. So yes, just thank you so much again to Francis, and thank you everybody for joining. I hope you have a lovely time, and we see you at another event soon. Thank you.